Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moblin coming at you again. This is another APUSH video. Once again, taking a look at topic 5.6. This is part 3 in this series, focusing in on the failure of compromise in the pretty unstable 1850s. Now, we mentioned previously that in the election of 1856, the Democrats are going to get James Buchanan elected president. And Buchanan is going to be able to win in part because he is one of the few remaining candidates, one of the few, nationally known figures that really didn't have a firm stance on slavery one way or the other. He's kind of similar to his predecessor, Franklin Pierce, in the sense that he's a northerner, in this case coming from Pennsylvania, but is willing to respect the rights of slave owners in the South. So he's kind of, once again, in that mushy middle, which is evaporating very quickly. But now that Buchanan's president, he now has to start making decisions regarding the fate and the future of slavery. And one of these is right here in Kansas. Now, we mentioned previously how Kansas is going to be, well, I guess the best term for it is victim of popular sovereignty, which is going to lead to the infamous Bleeding Kansas situation. And we mentioned that there were two different groups of residents of the Kansas Territory that each created their own state constitution, one in favor of slavery, one against slavery. Now, the one that was made up of Southerners that was in favor of slavery was known as the Lecompton Constitution, because that's the location in Kansas where it was agreed upon, Lecompton, Kansas. So they are the first ones to put together a constitution, and they submit it to Washington, D.C. for approval. Now, no, Congress has to make this decision, but Buchanan feels compelled to weigh in on this. And even though he is personally not someone that owns slaves, he believes that, per popular sovereignty, even though there might be disputes as to which is the official group making the Constitution, he basically believes that since Lecompton was first, they should be able to have that become the Constitution, which would then allow Kansas to come in as a slave state. Well, now, for those that were anti-slavery in the North, especially abolitionists, now Buchanan has stained himself with taking a side that seems to promote the expansion of slavery. That being said, it doesn't change Congress. Congress is not going to approve Kansas as a slave territory because there's still going to be a lot of concern about the legitimacy of this group from Lecompton really representing the residents of Kansas. So the Lecompton Constitution doesn't go through. It's still a territory by this point, but now Buchanan has basically, in the minds of Northerners and abolitionists, associated himself with the pro-slavery side, which is an anathema for them. And if that was bad enough, we ain't seen nothing yet, because right on the heels of that, we're going to be seeing the Supreme Court making a ruling on the issue of slavery to some extent in a way that is just going to blow up this country. This is the case of Scott versus Sanford. Dred Scott, as you can see pictured here, was a slave that was brought into a northern territory. He was moved from the slave state of Missouri to the free territory at the time of Wisconsin. And so through, a series of events, basically, Dred Scott is going to attempt to file a lawsuit claiming that since he was brought to a free territory, he should then by right be emancipated, should be free at that moment, since Wisconsin was a free territory. So the court at this time, led by Roger Taney. Now, note, Taney takes over the court upon the death of John Marshall before him. Taney is a Southerner. He's a Jackson appointee, so I can give you a little sense of his stance on the issue of slavery. And so the court had to decide whether or not Scott's claims were legit or not. Now, the first thing that the court does in their ruling is say that Scott's lawsuit is invalid because he is a slave. And the Constitution does not respect the rights of black people, according to the Supreme Court. So, in other words, if you're black, you're not a citizen. Period, end of story. And if you're not a citizen, you don't have legal standing to sue in the federal judiciary, which means that his lawsuit is rejected outright, period, end of story. Now, that's obviously a pretty racist and despicable attitude with regards to the rights of black Americans, but the court could have just left it at that and just kind of used it as a technicality to avoid this issue. But Taney doesn't do that. In only the second time in the court's history, judicial review will be applied to overturn a piece of legislation. And that legislation was the Missouri Compromise. Now, granted, part of the Missouri Compromise had already been repealed, the 3630 line, via the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But this is where the court weighs in a very pronounced way on the issue of slavery. The Taney-led Supreme Court is going to say that when the federal government in 1820 drew a line in the dirt, that 3630 line, and said that territory owned by the federal government north of that line would be free and south of that line would be open to slavery, was an arbitrary decision made by the government, and north of that line would arbitrarily violate the due process property rights of those that owned slaves. Therefore, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment due process protection. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Now, this is one heck of a bold statement. What the court is basically saying here is that the federal government has no authority to end slavery. It has no authority to do so in any territory that has not already become a state. Now they don't touch on the idea of, can a state vote to ban slavery? They didn't touch on that issue. And I think there's a general understanding that the court seemed to be okay with that as a right of the states. But as far as the federal government was concerned, the government could not just arbitrarily decide to take away certain people's property rights based on some arbitrary line drawn in the dirt. What does this mean as far as the court's concerned? Any territory now that is not a state, now those residents have the right to have slaves. Now, you want to talk about adding gasoline to a bonfire? Whoo, Nelly, the court sure did on this one. The South is going to see this as validation for their claims that they've had for several years now, that this is a due process property rights issue that the courts have recognized and upheld. And Northerners, particularly abolitionists, are going to view that the court is now in the pocket of fire-eating Southerners that are defending the expansion of slavery, that the court has sold out to the evil institution of slavery. So, even the court has now weighed in on this issue to some degree and has now divided the country even more. So it seems like there's nothing left that's holding this country together in terms of institutions that the nation as a whole can rally behind and legitimize and follow with any kind of consensus. Everything is now being viewed through the prism of slavery, and pretty much everybody has to take a side on this issue. And once you've taken a side, there really is no turning back. You have alienated the other side. Now, the final area of focus I wanted to take a look at today is the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates that are going to be taking place in 1858. Now, what this is going to be a fight for the Illinois U.S. Senate seat. Now, the incumbent was Stephen Douglas, the man that we had talked about before that was the brainchild behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was now a very highly controversial piece of legislation. But still, though, as the champion of popular sovereignty, he still has a pretty decent base of support across the country, and Douglas certainly has visions of being a future presidential candidate and seeing himself once again as kind of this heir of, the notion of compromise, the next Henry Clay, if you will. But the person challenging him for that Senate seat is an Illinois Republican by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Now, last time we talked about Lincoln was the young man that was a congressman that had tremendous criticism of the Mexican War and demanded that President Polk explicitly show where American blood was shed as a way to try to send the point that this was an unjustified war. It was just an invasion to expand slavery, yada, yada, yada. And with the creation of the new Republican Party as a party that is explicitly against the expansion of slavery, Lincoln's going to find a new home. Now, what's going to be unique and interesting about this debate is that these two candidates are going to agree to do something that was pretty unprecedented up to this point. A willingness to tour the state of Illinois and hosting a series of debates on various political issues of the time, and of course the number one being slavery. So, voters in that state would be able, and on several occasions, to be able to see these two candidates duel it out in a debate in person, and therefore put pressure on the state legislators in Illinois, who at that time actually chose U.S. senators. So this is really going to be quite a series of events, and it did not disappoint for sure. When we do talk about the debates, one of the major things that Lincoln tries to express is the idea that slavery has become such a divisive issue that we cannot move forward legitimately as a country that is going to stay divided on the issue of slavery. He says that a house divided cannot stand. So, in other words, we're going to have to make a decision on the issue of slavery once and for all. And from his perspective, that decision is that you cannot expand slavery. You just cannot do it. It has to be settled once and for all. You got to have legislation or a constitutional amendment that abolishes slavery in the West moving forward. Douglas, on the other hand, and note that House divided speech that Lincoln's going to give in one of the debates is going to be, very popular with those of the Whig Party, the former Whig Party, the new Republican Party, abolitionists, etc. Douglas is going to stumble a little bit, though, on what's going to be called the Freeport Doctrine. Now, this is from a speech at Freeport, Illinois. Remember, Douglas is the champion of popular sovereignty, and basically Lincoln kind of twists Douglas into a knot on the issue of how can you be in support of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people themselves have a right to vote on the issue of slavery themselves, while at the same time respecting the court's ruling in Dred Scott versus Sanford, which the court has said that the federal government cannot impose any kind of rules on slavery with regards to territories. The idea being is that, how can you jive this? How can this work together? And basically, Douglas is going to be forced to say that at the end of the day, he doesn't really agree with the Supreme Court's ruling. And with popular sovereignty, one of the possible outcomes is abolishing slavery. Well, when this comes out, Douglas once again he's trying to mold himself as this middle ground guy that is willing to accept both sides. But as we're moving here, you can't be on both sides of this issue. You got to be on one side or the other. And when Douglas, endorses popular sovereignty and admits that, this can lead to the abolishment of slavery in certain areas, well, then that totally alienates Southerners. And they no longer can trust him as somebody that would be in favor of their interests in terms of having an unadulterated right to expand slavery to the West. So Douglas, kind of comes out of this nationally as, kind of this wishy-washy figure. Yes, he's got a lot of support. Popular sovereignty folks like him. Lincoln comes out of this as very, very popular and respected with Republicans in this country. Now, note, in the end, Douglas actually does get the majority of Illinois legislative support to get the U.S. Senate seat. So Douglas wins the battle of the Illinois Senate seat, but what this really does is allow Lincoln to become this really well-known national figure, because these debates were recorded and printed in newspapers across the country. So what happens is that Lincoln, even though he has failed in an attempt to become a U.S. Senator, is now a nationally known figure and is seen as brilliant, yet folksy, and willing to have some leadership on the issue of slavery and not be one of these mushy middle candidates, which Douglas is, kind of making himself out to be. So this is certainly going to be a harbinger of things to come, because here's what's interesting. In 2 years, both Lincoln and Douglas will throw their hats into the ring to become the next president of the United States. Okay? All right, we will leave it there for this time. We'll see you next time.